From the Oklahoma newsroom, it's time for the Red Zone, our weekly extended look at Oklahoma football. I'm Jenni Carlson here in studio with fellow columnist Barry Tramel and OU beat writer Ryan Aber. Guys, Kansas comes to town. 6:30 start on Saturday, that game on Fox. I don't think we need to talk about the Jayhawks very much, but Ryan, we need to talk about the Sooners, particularly the defense after last week and that Bedlam game. You know, you wrote actually after or before the Texas Tech game that the tests were coming. And the last 2 weeks, Sooner defense was tested, and they did not get a passing grade. What has to change moving forward?
Well, just about everything. I will say I think they're tackling a little bit better than they were early in the season, but other than that, just most everything's been a disaster. They can't get consistent pressure on quarterbacks. Their linebackers get pushed back, and those tackles that they're making, and they're still racking up a lot of them. Kenneth Murray and Curtis Bolton especially are coming, 3, 4, 5 yards down the field, and they've struggled in coverage as well. On top of that, they're not forcing many turnovers. I wrote about that earlier this week. Oklahoma is on pace for an historic low in turnovers. They've only had 5 interceptions, 3 fumble recoveries, and only one of those fumble recoveries by the defense, that the fourth quarter one against Oklahoma State. Lincoln Riley says he feels like the turnovers are coming. A bunch of them are coming, but that time is running out.
Look, 6 against Kansas does not count. It does, but it doesn't. Barry, we're not going to see – we're going to see good defensive numbers this week because Kansas, not very good. David Beatty, lame duck coach, has already been fired. Kansas looking for the next coach. So we know just by that it's a disaster. But when you look big picture at this Oklahoma defense, to hear Ryan talk about all the problems – wholesale change is the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, there's 2 different issues here. What do you do about this team and what do you do about the future? Because this team's future is incredibly bright with that offense. The future is incredibly bright with the offensive culture that they have. But, the defensive culture has to be changed going forward. Structure, scheme, practice schematics, coaches, just nothing's work. It's just a total mess. Whether they have good players or not, we can debate. We know that they're not producing. But a more immediate question is, this team is still in the hunt for the college football playoff. The committee, to its ever-loving soul, is not really penalizing the Sooners too much for having a porous defense, which it has in years past. So, this is a team that's given up 93 points the last 2 weeks and is 2-0. And the committee seems to say, hey, you know what? Good for you guys. Can they keep that up? I don't think so. Can you score, 48 in West Virginia? Can you score 50 in a Big 12 title game? If you happen to make the Orange Bowl, can you score 50 in a college football semifinal? What they're asking their offense to do is probably not sustainable. It's going to bite the Sooners at some point, but any immediate fixes, I don't see any.
Ryan, I want to ask you about that in a second, but Barry, you bring up the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. Kansas, let's say the Sooners shut them out. Or, 3 points. I don't know, whatever low number you want to say.
And let's remember, it's been 4 years since Kansas scored more than 7 against the Sooners.
Okay, well, there you go.
If the Sooners hold them to less than 28, they should have a parade down Jenkins.
But in truth, it skews those overall numbers. It helps those averages. Does that at all look, even the optics, does that help at all in that selection room?
I don't think so because, like I said, I think the committee's actually doing what I've been asking them to do, which is just reward people for winning and losing and who you play. And how you get there, don't worry too much about that. Whether you block a punt or throw a Hail Mary or run a 14-play drive, shouldn't matter. And the committee seems to be saying, well, it doesn't matter. We know, if you beat Oklahoma State, you beat Oklahoma State. And so whatever they do with Kansas, now I don't recommend a 4-point game. I don't recommend winning this 38-34. The committee might not like that. But right now, I think it's just, I think style points are gone for the Sooners. They got to win out and just hope they get a little help from somebody above them.
You know, Ryan, Barry was talking about the issues of the immediacy and then the more long-term questions. And when Lincoln Riley was asked about defensive changes potentially on the coaching staff, he said this week that it's not really been decided. He's not really thinking about it just yet. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But
well, there's no chance it is.
Right.
But you can also understand why he says it.
Well, and that's my question to you. He's still got this team to think about. And if he starts talking about we're going to change this and change that, I mean, to me, that sends a pretty divisive message within that locker room that could potentially still make the playoff.
Yeah, he's got to keep this defense as much together as he can, keep this team as much together as he can, and not make it offense versus defense. I'm sure there's some feeling of that in the locker room, but you want to keep that down as much as possible. And I think Lincoln Riley, to this point, seems to have done a decent job of that. The offense hasn't gotten too overly frustrated publicly about what that defense has become, and he's boosted up his defense. The assistant coaches, Ruffin McNeil, the personnel on that side of the ball, as much as you can, but you've got to get a little bit more production on that side of the ball.
We've talked about how great this offense is. Historic is a word we've used, and it is, but they still have had some injury issues, Ryan. I mean, let's start with running back. As Lincoln Riley said a week ago, and it looks like it may still be the case this week, running back, they've got two guys essentially available. And, you lose Rodney Anderson, you lose Marcelius Sutton, and yet they're still producing great, but yet that has to be a real concern for them. Yeah,
no doubt about it. I mean, we saw Trey Sermon go down with a bit of an ankle injury on Saturday, and I think everybody sort of gasped on the OU side of what are they going to do here with just Kennedy Brooks. Now, Sermon was able just to get his ankle retaped and was able to come back in there, but at the same time, they're one more injury away from being in a really, really bad situation where you've got, maybe a guy like Jeremiah Hall becomes your running back. Last year, a couple years ago, they had to use Dimitri Flowers in that role when Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon were there, but Flowers was a little bit different makeup, older than Jeremiah Hall. Jeremiah Hall hadn't had to carry that load, so it would be a tough decision.
Barry, should we be even more impressed by the running game considering all these injuries?
Well, not necessarily, because they got a bunch of good ones. I mean, it's not like Trey Sermon was unproven. Kennedy Brooks was unproven, but he's but they go recruit really good tailbacks. When I think of that running game, I just think of that offensive line and the way they're just blowing holes. Kennedy Brooks is a phenomenal player, no doubt about it. But let me tell you what, there's a reason he's averaging 11 yards a carry. He runs sometimes 20 yards without a guy even getting within arm's reach of him. So the offensive line's doing a phenomenal job. That OU running game's working on all cylinders. Here's my advice for Lincoln Riley on Saturday. Get a big, quick lead, and then go to the walk-ons. Do not play Trey Sermon and Kennedy Brooks in the second half against Kansas. Don't do it. No matter how much you want to, don't do it.
Yeah. You mentioned those holes that offensive line is blowing open. I happened to be standing down behind the end zone when Trey Sermon scored the game winner last week, and I wrote about it. Calvin Bundage lying in wait, the big hitter for Oklahoma State, the linebacker, and it was like the sea parted in front of him, and you knew that the ball was coming through that hole because it was so monstrous. And sure enough, here comes Trey Sermon, big collision, but Sermon had that huge advantage of nobody touching him before he was essentially already on top of Calvin Bundage. So that offensive line doing great things, which leads us to our next topic, the center position. As tenuous as that running back position is, Ryan, it sounds like center unbelievably, maybe even more so.
Yeah, that's what happens when you lose Jonathan Alvarez, who had played a lot at center, started a lot of games there, and at guard. He had to fill in earlier this season when Ben Powers was a little bit banged up. Alvarez's season and career ends with an injury. Then the next guy up, Alex Dalton, tears his ACL for the third time during his OU career last week. So all of a sudden he's out, and that becomes a really tenuous position there. You've got Drew Samia, who has some flexibility. He's spent some time there in practice last year and earlier in this year, so you can use him there if you have to. But I talked to Samia earlier this week for a story on him for this weekend and asked him about that. And he said that Creed Humphrey's sort of the president right now because he's got the protection around him. They do not want him to get hurt. And it'll be interesting to see what they do if they do go to the walk-ons. what they do on the offensive line. Maybe you use a guy like Logan Roberson, the kid from Hera there, or just figure something else out just to get you by. But the problem at that position is it's hard to get somebody up to speed quickly, because you've got to get the center quarterback exchange on point.
And if you're doing it in practice, it can slow down practice just waiting for those two guys to mesh. Barry, another question about the offensive line before we get to picks. When you look at that offensive line, Creed Humphrey's obviously a young guy, but the rest of those guys on the older side, we've seen some award lists start to come out with those guys as finalists. How many of those guys could you see being sort of long-term NFL type guys? I'm not sure that I had started to think about that here until recently, but there's some real talent on that offensive line.
I think 3 or 4 of them have a chance. Like I was stunned today, we had the note, Ben Powers is an Outland Award finalist, one of the top 8, for crying out loud. If you polled, say, 20 people who cover the Sooners, I don't know that, I think less than half would say Ben Powers is even their best lineman. A lot of people would say Bobby Evans, a lot of people would say Cody Ford. Samia's had a good year. Just everybody's playing really well. So who their best player is really sort of in question. So it's an excellent line. It's a tip of the cap to Bill Bedenbow. He's really put together a solid unit there. He'll have to do some rebuilding next year, but because a lot of these guys are going to move on. A lot of these guys, Evans and Ford particularly, could declare early and go to the draft because they're going to have that pro potential.
Yeah. All right, before we get to picks, let me just say, I don't really know that we need to explain our picks today, guys. As I mentioned, Kansas, not good. Again, Ryan, you've got OU winning 63-20. Barry, you went 56-17. I went 62-13. So let's do a little something different. Who's the guy that you guys feel like we're going to absolutely have to put their name in the paper after the way they play against Kansas? Ryan?
Oh, it's going to be Kennedy Brooks, because you figure that line is going to blow up some big holes, and Kennedy Brooks is going to take advantage. And yet again, I think he's going to put up magnificent numbers.
Barry?
I'm going to guess Miles Tees has a big day. I bet Austin Kendall and Miles Tees has a pretty good second half. What I said about the tailbacks getting them out of the game, get Kyler Murray out of the game too, Lincoln. Get him out quick. You don't.
Although the question is, do you need to have him in there to put up big numbers when you're talking about Heisman?
We're not going to talk. I don't care about the Heisman. I do not care about that. Get him out of the game. I really don't want to see Sermon, Brooks, Kyler Murray, CeeDee Lamb, Marquise Brown. I don't want to see those 5 guys in the second half. If I do, I'm going to be mortally disappointed.
By the way, Tua, they're playing some FCS
the
team.
Citadel.
Yeah, so don't worry about Heisman stuff. I think we may have to continue to write about Kyler Murray, because even if he only plays a half or a quarter and a bit, he could still put up some massive numbers against the Jayhawks. It will be a rout. It's a 6:30 start on Saturday. Fox game if you're not going to Norman, but be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.